Hello, welcome everybody to the February 3rd, 2017 edition of the Intuit Developer Friday Morning Hangout. I'm your host, David Leary. Today we have a special guest, Aaron and Jared will be joining us. They are going to do an encore presentation of their QuickBooks Connect presentation, building a global app, understanding the global tax model and multi-currency. Just before we jump in, I just want to remind everybody that we are continuing this series of encore presentations of the QuickBooks Connect developer presentations. Next week, highly recommend Designing for Mobile with Joe Preston. He really takes an approach of how to build your app for mobile first and then adapt it for desktop after the fact. It's really a slick presentation. Lots and lots of nuggets in that presentation to take a handle on. Week after that, we'll be doing webhooks. This will actually be, I think, the third time now Vishal will be sharing webhooks on the Hangout. And before it was a preview, then it was when it launched, and now it's a little bit more detailed webhooks guide on how to utilize the webhooks to be more efficient in your app. And then, Aaron, if you could scroll down just to 2 tabs.
Sure.
I'm sorry, a little bit more. I'm going to get to the next set of.
More?
Yeah, a little bit more. Yeah. And then week after that, we're doing implementing analytic and optimization tools on your app. We've introduced a A/B testing tool. It's now open source. It's called Wasabi. And 2 of the members of that team are going to do their encore presentation of their A/B test of that A/B testing tool. And so, any questions you have about that tool, if you want to implement it in your app, implement it in your website, you could definitely. That's the one you want to attend and find that out. Then after that, before we know it, we'll be in London for the Small Business Hackathon. Hopefully, any of you that are watching this after the fact are in London or watching it live right now in London, please make sure you register for the hackathon and then show up to the QuickBooks Connect conference. We'll be doing open office hours. We'll have developer-based sessions. You'll be able to connect with other accountants and small business owners in the UK to really build out your app even deeper, those relationships. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jarred Keneally and Aaron Gourley. Aaron's in Canada right now. Jared's in Mountain View, California. I'm in Tucson, Arizona. And so we're truly are having a global experience here on this Hangout today. So Aaron, jump in.
Sure. Thanks, David. So yeah, as David mentioned, Jared and I shared this presentation at QuickBooks Connect this past year. So we're gonna be showing you essentially what it takes to build a global app. So among other things, we'll highlight some important details to help you understand the global tax model and multi-currency support that's available in QuickBooks Online. So my name's Aaron Gourley, and I'm a solutions engineer focusing on partner integrations with the Intuit developer group. I'm based out of Intuit's Mississauga office in Canada, primarily working with partners in Canada to help them build awesome apps for our mutual customers. I've worked directly on apps that are now live in Canada, Australia, the UK, as well as the United States. And Jared's also on the line. Jared, do you want to introduce yourself, or are you still heads down on something? Okay, I guess Jared's heads down. He's a GPM for developer relations. So he's been working with developers on QuickBooks for about the last 15 years. And fun fact is, or little trivia, I guess, he just said, did you know that QuickBooks SDK, the first version, came out in 2001, so over 15 years ago?
I'm here, but thanks for the intro.
Oh, sorry, I gave you an awkward amount of time to jump in.
Sorry, I was yapping away on mute.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. Anything you want to add, Jared?
Nope. Thanks for the intro.
So yeah, as far as the agenda goes, we'll start things off by talking about things to consider when building an app for a country outside of the U.S. From there, we'll cover some essential steps required to help you get started. Specifically, we'll explain how to enable connections from global QBO companies and turn on global sandboxes for development and testing. After that, we'll take a bit of a step back and look at some of the core QuickBooks features that you'll need to understand to effectively build your global app. And again, that's the global tax model and multi-currency. This will be followed by a demo of important API considerations. Oh, we got a cat. Important API considerations where we'll get our hands dirty with some REST calls. And finally, we'll wrap things up by going through some things you'll need to know in order to effectively launch and publish your app on the QuickBooks App Store. So first of all, just wanted to share some numbers. As you can see here, there's a large growing number of small businesses and accountants that are using apps and are doing their accounting in the cloud. So there really is a huge global opportunity to launch your app in regions outside of the U.S. There's a huge market out there. Many of our partners and developers started out in the U.S. only, and then enabled their application to work worldwide. And here's a few examples of some of the big players and where they're published. So now let's introduce how global app development differs from U.S. app development. It's important to understand that you have to look at everything involved in building and launching an app, since there's a lot more to it than just writing code and turning it on. So this slide gives a good overview of things that need to be taken into consideration during end-to-end testing. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that I'm just referencing one of my blog posts last week that covers this aspect in a lot more detail. So I'll refer you to that to dive a little deeper. But just to skim over it now, even before you write a single line of code, it's important to understand the market that you're developing an app for. So time needs to be spent learning about any relevant regulatory requirements applicable to the region, as well as geographic or political type factors such as time zones, common currencies, language differences, localization, etc. We'll cover the development aspects in more detail later, and there's also some links on the blog post that you can find at the Developer Hub at the bottom. On the testing side, your app needs to be tested using both sandbox and production trial accounts for all countries that you intend to launch in to ensure compliance. So this will help ensure that you're not going to mess up customers' books, which causes a huge waste of time for small business owners, bookkeepers, and accountants. Or even worse, it can get them into trouble with the government if they're misreporting anything really, income, expenses, taxes. It's also worth testing with accounts that have different preferences set up, since the state of things like sales tax, multi-currency, and shipping can fundamentally change the way some aspects of QuickBooks works. And prior to launching your app, it's important to consider what comes next once your app is in production. So, for example, if you're launching around the world, you're going to have to support multiple time zones. So you risk, you have to consider around-the-clock customer support and operational monitoring, so you can detect issues. Even if it's in the middle of the night for you, you still kind of have to be able to react to issues as they come up. A bit later, Jared's going to tell you a bit more about, we'll tell you a bit more about publishing on the QuickBooks App Store, so that you can easily get in front of the over 1.5 million QuickBooks Online subscribers globally. So essentially, to get you started, every application goes through a standard development lifecycle. Additionally, IDG, the Intuit Developer Group, has provided developers with tools specifically for global development. So if you go to this link, developer.intuit.com/get-started, it's definitely a good place to start. As far as global sandboxes go, every Intuit developer account comes with up to 5 sandboxes. You can create them for the US, Australia, the UK, India, Canada, and France. And each sandbox comes with sample data already added to it, so you can immediately start testing with it. You don't have to worry about bootstrapping data or anything like that. While Intuit has a global app store that focuses on countries that I just mentioned, your application can accept connections from any country that QuickBooks Online supports. So that's something that you need to configure in your application settings. The screenshot's shown here. If you only want to allow connections from one of the 5 geos here, you check that off. If you want to allow connections from any country that QuickBooks is available, you check off the all of the above button at the bottom. So in summary, where you choose to market your application is a different set of settings from which countries you accept connections from. So now I'll discuss some of the fundamental differences between the US and non-US versions of QuickBooks, the tax model, and multi-currency. Now, multi-currency technically is not different between the two, but it's certainly used more often outside of the US, so we thought it was important to cover it in this session. First of all, let's talk about the tax model. So it has 3 fundamental constructs. It has tax codes on the left, tax rates, and tax agencies. Now, a tax code is a container for more than one tax rate. It's used to group together tax rates into a single record so that they can easily be attached to individual transaction lines in a one-to-one fashion. A tax rate, on the other hand, defines an individual percentage rate that's collected by a government revenue agency, which we represent by a tax agency object. So in this example, it's an example from Canada, British Columbia. The GST rate would be collected by Canada Revenue Agency, which is the federal tax agency, and the PST rate would be collected by the provincial tax agency in British Columbia. And the tax code just brings those 2 things together so you can use them easily on an invoice or sales receipt or other transaction. You'll notice here that there's 2 different groups essentially of tax rates on a tax code. You have the sales ones and the purchase ones. The reason that we need to differentiate between the 2 is because the sales ones are used obviously on the sales transactions. Purchases are used on expense transactions. And the reason why we have to track the expense tax as well is because in many countries, essentially the small business owner can claim a tax credit based on a portion or all of the tax that they pay on purchases to run their business. It's worth noting that in order for sales tax integration to work properly, the sales tax center must be enabled in the QuickBooks Online company's UI. So this is a company by company setting. Since your app won't be able to guarantee this state, we do have an API call, which I'll show later, that allows you to check the state of the setting so that you can handle both the enabled and disabled cases gracefully. Once sales tax is turned on by a user, it can't be turned off, and it can't be manipulated on or off by any API call. It has to be done by the user. It's also noteworthy that using the entitlements API is the best way to determine whether a company is using the US or global tax model. This is important because I've seen a small number of US companies that are actually using the global tax model, so just checking the QuickBooks version for US or non-US isn't a fail-safe way. So the best way is to use the entitlements API whenever possible. The most important difference and visible difference between the US and global tax models in how they're used is how they're applied to transactions. So here I'm showing a couple of transactions. One's a global tax model invoice and one's a US invoice. So in the global, the tax codes are assigned to the individual line items. So you'll see here under sales tax, one of the items has HST Ontario and the other one has GST. Whereas, and also transactions can be marked as inclusive of tax or exclusive of tax. which is shown right above the sales tax column over there. In the US, a single tax code is added to the transaction. So here we see in the one on the right, there's tax code at the bottom is California, and that's applied to all of the taxable items on the invoice. So each line, instead of having a tax code for each item, has a checkbox that says if it's taxable or not taxable. So these differences are the biggest API level difference between the two, and there are different ways that you have, like different things you have to include in your API requests in order for it to work with the different models. Next, we'll take a look at multi-currency support in the Currency Center. So multi-currency is used when a business has one or more accounts, customers, vendors, or transactions that don't use the company's home currency. The actual exchange rates can be managed via the API, and they can be overridden from the API's default of 1 when transactions are created or updated. Since the default is 1, it's recommended that you first look up the exchange rate using the exchange rate API, and then add that exchange rate to your transaction creation request. And just one word of caution, we have seen some issues with using too many decimal places when you're specifying an exchange rate, so it's just recommended that you keep it to a reasonable number of digits of precision when trying to override the exchange rate. Like sales tax, this feature must be turned on in the company settings. This can only be done by the user. But its enabled or disabled state can again be looked up via an API call, which I can show later as well. As far as the Currency Center, QuickBooks Online allows the user to manage their supported currencies and exchange rates in the Currency Center, and they can be found under the gear icon in QuickBooks. As mentioned earlier, these currencies and exchange rates can also be managed through the API. So for convenience, any currencies referenced in customers, vendors, accounts, those are added automatically to the Currency Center. You don't have to have the user go to the Currency Center first and add them. You don't have to make API calls to add currencies first. You can just reference them in transactions and they'll show up here. All exchange rates are relative to the company's home currency, which is shown here as Canadian dollars is the home currency for that company, of course, not globally. So a couple of highlights couple takeaways from what we've covered so far. Apps can use the Preferences API to determine the enabled state of sales tax and multi-currency, and they should use the Entitlements API to determine which tax model to apply. I'll show examples of both of those later. You should also ensure that you test with different permutations of these settings to make sure that your app behaves well, not only for users in the different countries, but also for users with the different settings enabled or disabled. So now that we've done that, let's take a deeper dive into the APIs. Note, of course, that we do have SDKs available in many programming languages to help out with this. But just to boil things down to a common language, I'll be using our new Postman collection to make the API calls directly. So just bear with me for a second while I flip my screen around.
Aaron?
Yeah.
Can you post the URL for the Postman collection in the chat?
Sure.
Just so people have access to that.
Okay. I'll dig that up later, maybe during the question answer time.
Got it.
Okay. Get everything in order. Okay, which screen do you see right now? The Postman screen or the built-in Retina display screen?
The built-in Retina display still. It has not flipped over yet.
Let's see if I can get. Okay, looks like something crashed on my blue jeans. I'll have to start the sharing again.
Okay. Do you know if you, in that your Going Global blog post, did you link to the Postman there?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
It doesn't touch too much on the development aspect. It more focuses on the whole life cycle.
Got it. So I'll put that link to that blog post in the chat anyway, since I have it open.
Okay, see the Postman one now?
It looks like Jared actually put the Postman link in. I'm looking at your browser.
Okay.
And now we see Postman. Perfect. I'll go on mute and let you continue on. It looks like Jared did put the link in for Postman, which is awesome.
All right, thanks, Jared. Okay, before I get right into the demo, I'll just set some context. So the company that I'm testing with, it's a Canadian sandbox company, and this one has the multi-currency and the multi-currency and sales tax turned on already. It also has all the tax codes that I'm going to be using. They're already added to QuickBooks. So we go into Postman. Is the text big enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So I guess the first thing I'll demonstrate is I'll try to create an invoice that would work in the US version of QuickBooks. I'll try to create that same invoice in my Canadian sandbox. So in this case, we have 2 line items on this invoice, and they both have tax code ref set to tax, which in the US means it's a taxable line. So if I could go ahead and I try to create this invoice, we see that in the response, we got a validation error because we didn't specify a tax rate before saving. Or some of these messages are intended for the UI user, but essentially you get the idea of what it's trying to tell you here. So in order to fix that, the second request that I'll send is one that's been updated for global. So this one has, instead of tax code being set to tax, it has the tax code IDs set in the tax code ref. You can look up the tax code IDs using our tax code query endpoint, which I can show here. So our query endpoint, you basically it's like a SQL-like query. It doesn't support all of SQL, but certainly a good subset of it. So here I'll select some fields from tax code for the active tax codes, and what we get back is the names, the IDs, and the tax rates that are defined for it. And so the ones that I used in this transaction in particular are the HST Ontario is the 5, and GST by itself is number 9. So I'll go ahead and I'll create this invoice. And in our response, we see that it was successful. We have ID 245. We can see the 2 lines. Here's one of the lines with tax code 5. Here's the other line with tax code 9. And if we scroll down a little bit more, we see that QuickBooks has actually gone ahead and calculated the tax for each of the rates that is involved in that tax code and applied it to the transaction. So if I just flip over to QuickBooks, we can actually take a look at that one that was created. Okay, so here we have the two items on the invoice. The first one has sales tax, HST, Ontario. The second one has GST. And we can see the tax breakdown at the bottom of the transaction here. So these are the taxes calculated by QuickBooks. Okay, the next one I'll demonstrate is not only can you specify the tax code that you want to apply to each line, but you can also override the tax rates and the tax amounts. You can override the tax amounts that apply for the transaction. To do this, you specify the transaction tax detail element, and you have to specify one tax line for each tax rate that's referenced in the transaction. You can figure out which tax rates are referenced, again, by first starting at the tax code. If I just go in my tax code and I look for ID 5, so this is the HST Ontario one. Since this is an invoice, it's a sales transaction, and I can see that it contains tax rate 12, ID 12, and that's the HST Ontario one. And if I go to ID 9, which was our GST one, same thing. Under the sales tax rate list, I see 20. So it was 12 and 20. So in this case here, we need to specify the tax rates for both 12 and 20. We can override the amount of tax collected, the taxable amount that tax rate is applicable on, the tax percent, and and that's it. So if I create this, these numbers don't particularly make sense. It's just for demonstration purposes. I just put some ridiculous numbers that, nobody would calculate them like this, but it's just for illustration. So again, here we got a success. We see the lines created just like the last transaction, but we also see down here now that our tax amounts are overridden with our crazy custom values. So if I flip over to QuickBooks, I can show what the invoice looks like. And we see that even though this transaction was $550, for some reason we're applying the 13% HST only on $400 of the $500, and we're collecting $48. And same with the GST, we're only collecting it on $40 of the $50 for some reason. The next thing I'll show is, if I just flip back to QuickBooks for a second, I mentioned earlier that the global tax model has this combo box available for where you can specify if a transaction is exclusive of tax or inclusive of tax. That's also available in the API by specifying if I just scroll down in my request here, there's a field for the global tax calculation. And so you can specify if it's tax inclusive, tax exclusive, or out of scope. So creating this one, we'll see that the taxes don't get added to the invoice, but instead they're included. There's not much difference about the response to look at here, other than the fact that QuickBooks still calculated the tax in this case, and it has the global tax calculation as tax inclusive. Just flipping back to QuickBooks again. We can see that this invoice of $550 is marked as tax inclusive, and it's just calculated the tax a little bit differently based on an inclusive calculation to get a total of 550 instead of adding tax to the 550. Switching over to the expense side of things, so now I'll illustrate the use of the purchase tax rates instead of the sales tax rates. Here we have, we're creating a purchase or an expense transaction with a single line. This one references tax code 5, which is again the same as our, I believe it was the HST Ontario one. And we're also overriding the tax on this expense transaction. But this time we're referencing tax rate 11. So just to show where that came from, I'll switch over to our tax rate query that we ran earlier. Or actually, I didn't run the tax code query that we ran earlier. I'll go to the HST one, and we see that instead of looking in the sales tax rate list for expenses, we look in the purchase tax rate list, and we see there's tax rate 11 in here. So this is the tax rate that you should apply to your expenses. So we've done that. We've overridden it with tax rate 11. I'll go ahead and I'll create this. We see that that was successful. We see at the bottom that has our line and it has our tax detail where it's referencing tax rate 11. I don't think it's too exciting in here for what the expense looks like, but essentially we see that it has, right, my screen resolution's off. It usually doesn't render the row this big, but we have one line on this expense with the tax rate as HST. The tax is reported at the bottom. Okay, on the multi-currency side of the demo, I'll show how you can create customers. You can do this similar things for accounts and vendors as well, but for customers, here's a request where I'm just going to create a customer. I'm not going to specify anything about the currency that they use. And since my home currency of my QuickBooks Sandbox is Canadian dollars, it should create this customer as a Canadian dollar customer. And we can see in the response below that it says currency reference is Canadian dollar, and the rest of the fields that we didn't specify are filled in as well. Just to illustrate how you can override the currency, we'll create another customer where we'll specify the British pound as the currency for this customer. So if I create this one, we can see that it was created successfully, and the currency that's referenced is the British pound. One thing I want to call out about this is that when you're creating invoices and sales transactions with a different currency, if you're referencing a customer that has a currency set, so in this case, this one is the British pound, you can't create an invoice or a sales receipt for that referencing that customer with a different currency other than the British pound. So the customer's currency is tied to the customer and can't be changed on the transaction level in that case. I also mentioned earlier that you can look up exchange rates using our API. So here's one where you can look up an individual exchange rate. So here you can specify the source currency code. So I can say I want the Hong Kong currency and the date of that exchange rate. So if I send this one, you can see that I got the exchange rate for that currency conversion on that day. You can also look up multiple exchange rates at once using the query API or the exchange rate query. So here I'm going to look for the euro and US dollar one on that same date. So I should get 2 back in this case. And we did. We got the US to Canadian dollar and the euro to Canadian dollar on that date. Okay, just let me flip through and find the next. Okay. So just to illustrate how it's used to create transactions, we can create an invoice as we were doing before, but this time we can override the currency using the currency ref attribute. And everything else is the same. You still have to provide your tax codes according to the global tax model. It's just you're collecting it in a different base currency. So I'll create this one and then I'll show it in QuickBooks. So now I've created the invoice. We got ID 249. The currency reference is US dollar. Note that I didn't specify an exchange rate in my request, so it used the default of 1. So this is where I mentioned earlier, it's a good idea to query the exchange rate API first to get the exchange rate on this date, and then fill it in. You're overriding the currency. So here we see that the invoice I created is in US dollars, and the exchange rate is shown here as 1-to-1. And you can see at the bottom it gives you the differences. So if the exchange rate wasn't 1, it would show you different totals for US and Canadian dollars. So it still gives you your home currency amount as well. And quickly, so we can also override the exchange rate, as I mentioned. So in this case, I'll make another invoice. This time I'll say US dollar, exchange rate 1.4. Go ahead and create that. Okay, success. So we got our ID. We can see the result had currency US, exchange rate 1.4. And that showed up properly here. So we have US dollars 1.4, and our totals reflect the exchange rate difference. And I'm going a little bit fast, but I'm trying to leave some time for question and answer at the end, so apologies for that. So one other thing that I want to demonstrate is if I reference a customer that, so let me just bring up this customer, 59. I believe it's this one. So this customer has currency of overridden to Hong Kong dollar. So if I try to create an invoice using this customer, but say that I'm reporting it in US dollars, I could get an error. Yeah, so the error I get is that the currency of the transaction is not valid for that customer. And finally, the last thing I'll show in this demo is kind of a transaction that can cover all of the elements that we've talked about so far. So in a deposit, a bank deposit transaction, you can specify, you can override the currency and the exchange rate. You can also specify line items on the deposit where you can override the tax rate, or you can set the tax rate on those lines. And you can override the tax amounts for each of the tax rates. And you can say is it tax inclusive, out of scope, or tax excluded? So here now we've created a deposit. All of that stuff is overridden. So if I go over to QuickBooks, I can show you what that looks like in So we have a bank deposit now. The currency is Hong Kong dollar. The exchange rate is 0.15. And we have a line item on the deposit that's HST. It's exclusive of tax. And we've overridden the tax amount as well. So this brings kind of everything back together. I think that concludes the demo. So yeah, just bear with me for one more second while I switch back to the presentation mode.
Got it. So I'll let you flip back over, and while he's doing that, those of you who have any questions, feel free to start preparing those, and we will take a little bit of questions here in about probably 3 or 4 minutes. About a good solid 15 minutes. So any questions related to taking your app global, multi-currency, any of the stuff on the global tax model, the VAT tax, any of those types of questions that Aaron covered, definitely have those ready to go. As Aaron's trying to figure out how to flip it over. And for those of you who are here and obviously have an interest in global, if you can swing it in the States, please travel to the UK for our QuickBooks Connect UK and our Small Business Hackathon that's going to take place in London. The 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th will be in London for those events. Those of you that are in London, please don't forget to register. You can go to smallbizhack.com and register for the hackathon, and quickbooksconnect.com/UK to register for the QuickBooks Connect conference. I'll put those links in the chat here.
Almost done. It's tricky in this meeting room.
Got it. Other one is.
Okay, good. Do you see which
Yes,
screen do you see?
we can see it now, Aaron.
You see the agenda?
Yes, we're back to the agenda. Correct.
Okay, so next we'll just cover some details about how to actually launch your app, take it global, publish it in the App Store, stuff like that. So I'm not going to read through this slide. So if you want, you can take a screenshot of it, or also our slides are shared on SlideShare. You can find links to the slides on the developer.intuit.com hub under events. I believe it's listed there.
Yeah, there's a button that says discuss, and then that discuss button will take you to the discussion page that has the embedded SlideShare right on it.
Right. So just a few tips and tricks for actually going global, launching, configuring your app, developer portal, stuff like that. Also, just want to call out some specific global requirements that you should consider as well. They're listed here. There's also plenty of documentation on the developer portal about this sort of thing. Just want to illustrate here, when you're publishing your app, you can, as you add support for other regions, you can basically specify different app card content for each region so that you can really reach out to and market yourself to each region. There might be different languages and verbiage around how you want to present your feature set. You can also specify different pricing plans local support info, FAQs, phone numbers, different kind of company and legal URLs depending on the region, and you can customize screenshots if there's like currency references or anything that differs between your regions. And here's just an example of our Receipt Bank app, of Receipt Bank's app card, their pricing, and how you can see that kind of customized for the UK region. It's in pounds and has references VAT instead of sales tax, stuff like that. So after you finish completing your app card, all you have to do is submit it for review at the bottom by checking off the box and clicking submit for review. After you submit, the technical and security review is going to be triggered, and those requirements are not country specific. And your app will be tested with the proper version of QuickBooks depending on which region you're publishing in. If you've already published in one region and you've already passed the technical and security requirements, there's still a technical review triggered for the new region, just to make sure that your app is still functional in the added regions. But yeah, you don't have to publish them in all regions at the same time. You can build for one and incrementally add support for other regions. And that concludes the presentation. So we can maybe take it away, David, and we can go to questions and answers.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, we'll definitely open it up to questions. And I think David and Corey actually had some questions regarding it's sales tax related, but it looks like it's going to be related to North Dakota and Maryland for gross receipts tax. So I don't know, maybe if we're lucky, Aaron, you have some experience with that, but we'll find out. So yeah, David and Corey, if you want to unmute, jump in. All right, looks like they may be having a problem trying to unmute. So Aaron, they did put in the chat that they had a question about U.S. tax in North Dakota and Maryland, the gross receipts tax. They said tax on a tax. How do you do it in QBO? I'm actually myself. I'm kind of googling this and seeing if there's a YouTube video or something on this already. I'm not familiar that this is done differently.
I'm not too familiar with that in the U.S., but I know you can configure tax on tax in the sales tax center. So bear with me. This is really hard for me to use here because I'm actually clicking on my screen share, so there's a bit of a lag.
Okay.
But if I'm creating a sales tax, so I believe the U.S. has only the bottom three options. I really hope I'm going to the right one because it's going to take me forever to go back. Yeah, it's essentially somewhere in one of these forms. You can specify if it's tax on tax or what. You have to put a tax agency as well. Yeah. So in this custom tax I'm creating, it's very common to have to do this in the US version of QuickBooks, because when you turn on Sales Tax Center in the US, it doesn't come pre-created with any taxes. So essentially you're setting this up from scratch. In global regions, Australia, the UK, and Canada, they create the appropriate common tax codes based on the regions that you're operating in. I don't know why this isn't opening up here. But normally under this rate applies to section, there's rate applies to sales, rate applies to taxes, or rate applies to sales plus tax. So you can support tax codes that do tax on tax by setting it up in this way.
It also looks like Avalara, who's another app on the platform, right? They specialize in like sales tax calculations, sales nexuses, sales tax collection and payment. They actually have a PDF just on like they've created their own PDF, a user's guide just for sales tax in QuickBooks. So that might actually help a little bit. I pasted the link for that in there.
Okay.
This is Corey. We finally figured it out.
Oh, good.
Thanks for showing me that gross receipts tax, because North Dakota does a tax on top of tax. But I didn't see that how to get to those screens, but I'll go look for them in our U.S. QuickBooks.
Okay.
And I also have Maryland. The state of Maryland forces a roundup of any fractional cents. And are there rules to round your sales taxes in QuickBooks or not?
No, so you can't really tweak the way the taxes are calculated by QuickBooks. So that's where it's really useful when you know better than QuickBooks, or like where it's most relevant is when say you're a payment app and you've collected physical payment, you've collected a certain amount of tax physically, and the way that you as a payment app have calculated that tax differs from QuickBooks. You need to basically override what QuickBooks would have calculated. So that's the type of use case why we support overriding the taxes. So it sounds like probably in these cases where different states do different rounding, you probably need to override the taxes in those cases as well.
Well, I'm just wondering that, you guys sell QuickBooks in Maryland. How does a Maryland person actually calculate the right tax? That's fine. We'll figure it out. In general, I have a question about creating our own app here that we want to integrate with QuickBooks. And we want to do like a work order. We want to add labor and parts and total it up, but we don't want to calculate the tax in our app. And then we want to send it over to QuickBooks as an invoice and make QuickBooks calculate the tax. Is that a good strategy, or should we have calculated the tax before we send it to QuickBooks?
I would probably recommend taking a look at like Avalara. Avalara has APIs, and you could use them to calculate. You're passing in the address, and they are experts in sales tax calculation. And then you'd go to them, get your sales tax amount, put it in, then just stick it into QuickBooks. Let me paste the link in here for their developer page.
Yeah, we've looked at that.
And then you don't have to worry about keeping track of all the states and the counties and all the nexuses and all the rules for sales tax.
Does QuickBooks have an integration with Avalara, like on your side?
Avalara has an integration with QuickBooks.
They do? Okay.
They do, yeah. But we don't go out. We're not reading. And I've actually talked to the Avalara guys about this a while ago. I was like, it almost makes more sense for us to integrate with Avalara because they're providing that function. But chances are, almost like most e-commerce websites you've ever been to, they are using Avalara to calculate their sales tax.
True.
If they're shipping to other places, and Avalara has a whole different stacks, right? You could make API calls, but then they have like somebody like an Amazon, let's say, would stick Avalara blades right in their server racks. They're not even making API calls, right? So there's different levels of integration, but they also have integration to help calculate sales tax, but then they also have a integration to actually track the sales tax, and then they handle the e-payment and e-filing of the sales tax reports for clients also.
Okay.
So they have accountant and customer facing products, but then they also have stuff for developers also.
Yep. In the end, we're doing taxes in half, one way or the other. We get by with this. Really, just doesn't cover us at least.
Did anybody else have any questions? I know, Jack, you're here. Jonathan, Serenthi, do you guys have any questions at all on going global with your apps? So,
David.
Aaron, oh, go ahead. Jonathan, yes.
If you set a customer to a specific exchange rate, then you cannot have invoices or other transactions with a different exchange rate. That's what I heard, right?
Exchange rate is fine. You can change that because obviously that changes day to day. It's the currency reference. You can't.
I know, right? I mean, excuse me. I mean currency, right?
Yeah.
Right, currency reference. So once you set it, okay, can you unset it? I mean, if you realize this customer now is going to be buying in different currencies.
No. Unfortunately, once it's set for a customer, it can't be changed or removed.
So you'd have to add that customer a second time to QuickBooks, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure the accounting implications of why we restrict it, but presumably there's a reason.
It's like one of those one-way things, kind of like setting an inventory start date. You know, if you set it to today, it's hard to post any transactions that happened before today.
Yeah.
With that product.
Yeah, we had that problem years ago, and what we did is just create a new customer with the currency code at the end of their name, like John Smith -USD.
Right.
And I think and this is me looking rusty now, if you put a squiggly bracket and then put anything in the squiggly bracket at the end of somebody's name and then close the bracket, that'll appear in your QuickBooks, but won't actually appear when you print things out, send emails, etc. QuickBooks will ignore that. So you could have that in there, but then it won't actually show up anywhere but on your side. I might have to test and find out if that's true in QuickBooks online, but it was definitely somebody used to always doing QuickBooks payroll back in the day, because a lot of times you'd have two employees with the same name, and how do you know which employee is which? It's a good question, Jonathan. So are any of you taking your app global soon to another region?
We are. I actually have another question. It seems like when I create a global invoice, I have to have, like you said, I have to have a tax code for every line. Excuse me, never mind. I think I'd see the answer. So the same thing. If you say tax inclusive, that's going to be the same rule anyway. That doesn't affect that. That would have been my question. Okay.
And yeah, the trickiest part of overriding taxes again is you have to specify. If you're overriding taxes for any individual rate, you have to specify. You have to override all of the rates. You can't do a subset of them, and you can't do too many. It has to be the exact list of rates that are referenced in the tax codes.
So Aaron, obviously with you being up on our Canadian team, you've probably seen a lot of apps make that transition from being in the States first and then going into the Canadian region. Like, what are some mistakes you've seen that apps have made, and like what are some like really good ideas that like, hey, everybody should do this because here's the benefit of that when you go to another region?
I wouldn't say it's a mistake that they've made, like when they after launching, because you wouldn't get that far. But one thing that is definitely the biggest pitfall is like people don't necessarily realize that the representation of tax on the invoices, it seems like a small difference, but fundamentally it breaks their API calls if they just try to start using their app directly in the US. Or my perspective, I see people going from Canada to the US more, but it happens the other way around too. But people are, I'd say sometimes it's an unpleasant surprise that it's like, oh wait, I have to develop a whole nother kind of tax handling mechanism now for the US or for Canada. But yeah, I think it's important to call out, like, be aware of that going in, plan for it, and that way you won't be surprised when it's time to go and you're like, oh, there's a whole bunch more work I have to do now.
Yeah, I think that's something developers need to keep in mind, because over here on one hand, we've made the API global, right? So if you integrate with the QuickBooks Online V3 API, your app can work with any QuickBooks that's anywhere in the world, right? You have control over that. But if you do any sales tax things, there's certain parts of the code, if you touch, you need to make sure you're handling it correct for that region. And it's something that at least you're not having to write all brand new code, but you do have to write code to handle those specific use cases for sure.
I have a question about Canada.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what's the reality? We've had an app for many years, and we've gone to Canada, and we've gone through all the taxing changes and all of our documents. But one thing we can't do is go to Quebec. What's the real law there about having French documents and stuff? What's the requirements of Quebec?
I believe I don't think there's anything on our side that's a technical requirement, not that I'm aware of anyways, but I do know that the Quebec government has laws. I don't know if it must be laws that say that you have, like, if your customer is dealing in French, like, you have to be able to provide a French experience to them. So I don't know how fuzzy that line gets with apps, because I do know that there's some apps that are available in Quebec that aren't multilingual, but certainly I've dealt with some companies that really need to provide that French experience for their French users.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, what I was just sharing on the screen here is anywhere where there is special fields or special callouts that for like specific regions, there will usually be the flags for the regions that these fields apply to. So the global tax calculation is for essentially the global regions, not the US region. So as you're planning things, you can refer to the documentation to see what differences there might be to anticipate them.
Okay. And just to keep in mind, like, these are the regions we have documented. I think, there's other regions you might be working in that there's rules that we don't have documentation for. And you just have to be aware of those. But this catches most of the user base for sure. Hey, Aaron, it looks like we're past the top of the hour. So I don't know if you have any passing thoughts, but I'd like to thank you for coming on the Hangout this week. Thanks everybody for attending. And I'll let you give your one last statement here.
No, thanks for coming. It's always awesome to engage with developers and the broader QuickBooks community. So it was my pleasure to join the session, and I hope to do more of these in the future. That would be awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Jared. See everybody next week.
Okay.